Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our NDE virtual day and participating with us virtually. Make up for the fact that we can't get to Kearney. We're going to be talking today about discipline data in Advisor and a little bit about the agenda up here, but I want to talk a little bit first about why we're doing this session. This is pretty much a repeat of the session that we did in Kearney at the NDE's data conference in April. And while we were there, many of the data stewards who were in the audience asked us to present this to the administrators so you'd have a good understanding of what kind of data we're collecting related to discipline in the Advisor system and why we're doing it. So if you participated in the conference, if you were at that session in Kearney, just to let you know, this will pretty much be a repeat of that information. And you can obviously continue to stay if you want, but if you'd like to go on to another session, feel free. It won't hurt my feelings at all. But for those of you that weren't in Kearney or just want a refresher, we'll go ahead and go over this information with you now. So this is a little bit about the agenda. We're going to be talking a little bit about something called EdFacts. We're going to be talking about the civil rights data collection. And then we're going to be talking about how both of those affect the discipline data that we collected in Advisor for 2018-19 and also the data we're going to be collecting for 2019-2020. We won't get a lot into the details on how to do the work. We'll have a couple of quick examples just to show you how detailed it can be. We are going to try to focus more on why and what kind of data in general. We'll let your data stewards and the people actually entering the data in the system get really into the weeds about the specific codes that are available. And then at the end, there will be an opportunity for you to put your questions in to the chat box. Robin Gonzalez is also here with me. My name, I think I forgot to say at the beginning, is Jill Arend. I am with the Data Research and Evaluation team, the Director of Data Collections. And then Robin here with the Special Education team.
And I'm the data manager over there, usually the person that the data steward or SPED director contacts for special education related data reporting.
Yeah, and I have her here because so much of the data complications and twists and turns come about with the special education students. So I wanted to also make sure that we had her viewpoint here when we're giving you this information today. Okay, so a little bit, in case you didn't realize this, a little bit about the discipline data beginning with 2018-2019, so this year that just ended, we did start collecting student level data in Advisor related to discipline. And what this means is that we no longer collect that data in aggregate for the public districts. It's a little different for the non-publics. But for the public districts, there is no longer a need to report your discipline data in the report of suspensions and expulsions in the CDC. We do have one flag still in there, one basically where you attest that you've met certain state and federal statutes. You go in there and click it and sign it there. Next year, our plan is to take that attestation and put it actually into the Advisor validation where you approve your collection. So we'll actually get rid of it completely for public districts in 1920. Also, the SPED Discipline Information System is no longer a collection that starting with 1819.
So, and if you're not familiar with that, that is the collection that the data steward would go into at the end of the school year and input all the suspensions and expulsions and discipline related data for the prior school year, the school year that's ending. It was a really pretty archaic system. I spoke to a lot of SPED directors come the end of the year on getting that data in and correct. I've had a lot of confusion this year, a lot of people contacting me, asking me when that's going to open. And I think it's just some confusion on now that we don't have that to enter it into, where do we enter this data? And that data will be what you are putting in as these events happen in Advisor with that student level data. So just a little clarification around that, because I know that recently there was some some anxiety and confusion about that.
And like she said, we are putting that data in Advisor starting with last year, 2018, 2019. Now, because this is a new set of data that we're collecting at the student level, and because our team, the DRE team, was working throughout the year to get the Advisor validation system really getting everything in it that we needed, the discipline data we didn't have everything in the system needed in order to validate the data by the end of the year. So for 2018, 2019 only, we are going to allow discipline data to be edited and cleaned up throughout the follow-up collection. So that's the 18-19 follow-up collection. And what that means for your data stewards, for your people in your offices who are putting the data in your student information system, is they can continue to clean up the data in last year or the 18-19 set of SIS data, whatever your vendor you're using. They can continue to clean that data up through October 15th. They don't need to submit any files. Again, they're putting it into your student information system and it goes directly into Advisor from there. But they can continue looking at the reports. We have a couple of reports out on the Advisor validation now that they can start looking at. We're going to have one more coming out that is going to show student-specific detail information on each incident, the students, the behaviors, etc. This is intended to help you with some more of that follow-up. So that report is going to be coming up yet next month in August. And someone sounds like you might need to mute your computer or your phone. We're getting a little feedback here. Okay, so again, 18-19 will allow changes through the end of October audit window. For 19-20, it will become a year-end collection due date. So just like most of the rest of the year-end data, it will be due and need to be cleaned up by the end of June of 2020. Now, the nice thing is that we will have the reports up and going then in the 19-20 school year. So your data stewards can be looking at the data and making sure it's correct throughout the year as they enter the discipline incidents into the student information system. So if you have your data stewards asking you questions about 18-19 discipline data into the beginning of next year, that's why. They're still cleaning it up, still working on it, still trying to make sure it's all ready to go so that we can pull the data when we need it. So I'm going to get into now a little bit about something called EdFacts. Now, EdFacts, for those of you, most of you probably have never heard of this. This is how we, as a state education agency, submit our data to the U.S. Department of Education. And why is this important to you? Well, all this data that we collect in Advisor, in the CDC, and even some financial data that we get from places like GMS, this is data that we have to in turn submit to the federal government. And you can see there's multiple program areas that we submit data for, including discipline data. So, we submit membership data, special education data, free reduced lunch data, a lot of data. We start submitting in February of the year that we're submitting for, and it goes through the next February. So it's a whole year cycle that we're submitting data for individual school years. But discipline is one of the areas that we're submitting data for EdFacts. A little bit more about EdFacts too, just to let you know, you guys used to submit files to NSSRS to us. Well, that's how we submit data to EdFacts. And there's actually 80 different file areas that we submit. They're called file specifications. Each of those file specifications may require between 1 and 3 files for us to submit. So altogether, we actually submit 147 different CSV files to the federal government on an annual basis throughout the year. So we are using your data, we are submitting it up, and this is also the reason that when we're looking at your data, we're looking for it to not have these errors. We throw these errors out on the validation website, because if those aren't cleaned up, when we try to submit them to the federal government, we'll get errors on that end. So getting your data cleaned up also helps us get the data submitted up to EDFACS and to the U.S. Department of Education.
And one reason why we have to be fairly strict with the deadlines we give is that we get zero slack on our EDFACS submissions. If it's not in by 11:59 on the due date that they give us, we get a 0 on timeliness, reliable, and valid data. And that affects our, in SPED's world, our overall determination for the year. So it's super important on the deadlines that we are given that we have that data ready, which means we have to back it up enough that we can make sure that we check it for validity and being reliable, and give ourselves that window should the EDFACS system go down, because usually the federal submission sites are overloaded in the last couple of days. Yeah. So we always try to kind of beat the rush to make sure that we get everything in when we need to. So that's kind of why we get really, and by we, I mean me, why I get after people or send out a lot of reminders on getting data in when we want it. It's not really based on when we want it. It's when the feds ask for it or demand it.
And I can tell you this year, with the allowance that we're giving on discipline data through the end of the follow-up window, we're actually going to have 6 calendar days. The window will close, the audit window will close October 31st. We have to have the data submitted November 6th. So we aren't going to have a lot of free time. So there's not going to be time to do a lot of cleanup after the end of that follow-up window for the 18-19 discipline and enrollment data. We also are submitting exiters during that time frame. Okay. Also, one more time, the specific discipline files that we submit in EDFACS, there are 5 that are IDEA specific, 3 that have both IDEA and general population students. So there are 8 total file specs, 16 total files that we have to submit. So you can see there's a lot of work on our end also. Okay. And then these are some of the specific areas of information that we have to have in the IDEA specific files that we submit to EDFACS. And you'll recognize, if you've ever did the special education discipline collection in the portal, you'll recognize some of these terms because they are specifically used in the IDEA files.
If you were a submitter of the old discipline system, these were the top boxes you filled out. Unilateral removal was the very first thing, and then these separate offenses were up there as well before you got down to the demographics of the students.
It's the other area that really is affecting what discipline data you have to have at the district level, is the civil rights data collection. I'm sure there's 50 people on this call, and I'm sure 48 of you know what the civil rights data collection is. But for the 2 of you or so that don't, it's an every other year collection that's made to the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education. We're currently in the 17-18 collection. Districts are working on submitting data if they haven't finished it already. Because it is an every other year collection, 2019-2020 will be the next year of the civil rights data collection that is submitted to the USDE. Now, much of the data that is needed for the civil rights data collection is already in Advisor, and that isn't could be added. And so many states have started helping the districts with their submission by taking the data they already have and doing an initial submission to the civil rights data collection at the Office of Civil Rights in order to lessen the burden on the school districts. And we started talking a few years ago about also starting to work on this and helping out the districts in our state with their data. We decided not to do it for 17-18 because it was the last year of NSSRS, which means that for 2019-2020, we are going to be trying to help you guys out by aggregating and submitting as much data as we can from Advisor into the 1920 Civil Rights Data Collection. Of course, we don't know what exact data they're going to be asking for yet. I actually was in Washington, D.C. last week, and there was a session that said 2019-2020 changes to the Civil Rights Data Collection. I was really excited, went to that session, got in there, and what they said was, well, we don't know yet. And I kind of went, why are you doing the session then? So we don't know what's going to be in there. We do know what was being asked for 17-18. And so we did design what we're going to have, and the reports we're going to design and we have been working on are based on the 17-18 collection. One of the things the Civil Rights Data Collection does do is that anytime they add new elements for a year, they make them voluntary for the first collection cycle, which means that if they do add something that there's no way you could have gotten or we could collect, it will not be mandatory to report for this first year. But we will have reports available in the Advisor Validation website. What we will do when they open up the Civil Rights Data Collection for submission, what they typically do is they open it up before you guys are ever able to get in there. They've opened it up for states to do that initial submission. We've never done it. So when you've gone in, it's always didn't have any data in there. What we will do this time is we will go in and we will submit that initial file and pre-populate a number of those elements for you based upon the data that you have in Advisor. At that point then, when they open the CRDC up to districts, you'll be able to go in, review the data, make changes to any of the fields that you want to change, submit your own files if you want at that point, or just fill in missing elements, and then go through the regular submission like you've typically done. We will not be able to resubmit once districts are allowed into the collection. So we will be taking a look. It'll be a one-time upload for us to get that data in to try to help the districts, because we know, particularly for the smaller districts, it becomes quite the burden. And not that it's not a burden for the large districts, but a lot of them have a lot of the procedures in place already to do this work every year. But regardless of the district size, we'll be able to submit it for any or all of you based upon what data you've gotten into Advisor. Some of the areas, if you're not familiar with CRDC, that they do collect, there is a lot of different areas of information that they collect. Teachers, school finance, district characteristics, but discipline, again, is a lot of the data. And there's a lot of different breakdowns that they have of this data in the system. Some of the additional information that we need in order to help you with your submissions include some school and school technology questions, some specific section characteristics, some additional behaviors and elements for discipline data, restraint data, which we don't otherwise collect, but the system is now allowed to accept that data. The one area we did not put into Advisor to allow us to submit was interscholastic athletics for the 1920 CRDC. We will do an after action after the 1920 CRDC to help us kind of determine what we're going to be doing for 21-22. So discipline data in the CRDC, there's a lot of breakdowns. And again, this goes into why collecting the data in Advisor in one group is going to help us parse it out for the EDFAC submissions and for the state requirements and for the CRDC data that you need anyway to do your CRDC submissions if you were to do it on your own. So there's in-school suspension data, out-of-school suspension data, expulsion data. There's a lot of different demographic breakdowns that they do. For expulsions, we have to know with and without services, and if it's because of a zero tolerance policy. They want data for both PK and K-12. So you can see all these different areas that some of these are things we never did collect before where we would need to do just for CRDC. That includes transfers to alternative schools, referral to law enforcement, arrested for school-related activity. Corporal punishment is in the CRDC. We did not include it in our collection because it is prohibited by Nebraska state law. Some of the behaviors that they include are, you can see them listed here, but this did influence what behaviors we're going to start collecting in Advisor in order to get these different levels of data for the CRDC. So taking a look at the 2019-2020 Advisor Discipline Collection. Again, districts, you guys as districts are continuing to clean up and work on and validate your discipline data in Advisor. So you may have your staff working on last year's data. When we go over some of the updated list of behaviors and actions, just know that that list may be slightly different for last year. But we did update the list of behaviors and weapons. We simplified the discipline actions, added a few additional elements, and added victim information for harassment and bullying specifically for the CRDC. And most of these changes were made specifically for the CRDC. So these are the list of 18-19 behaviors. You can see we tried to break out some special education behaviors that are needed for the special education reporting to EDFACS. A lot of the feedback we got from districts was the people entering this information in the system don't necessarily know if the student is SPED. So we decided in 1920 to actually go and remove those, and we will derive whether or not the student is special education and needs to be included in those files based upon the special education data that you also submit to Advisor. So this list of behaviors, if you remember the list that I had for the CRDC, is almost completely driven by the CRDC requirements. One area that's a little different is the drugs. We did have that drugs excluding tobacco. That's specifically driven by the special education requirements. The different areas of harassment or bullying are, again, specifically CRDC. So you need this information at your district anyway if you're going to be submitting CRDC data on your own. If you want us to do the submission for you, through that initial upload at the beginning of the year, you put the data into Advisor. And so all of these different behaviors will be available should be available in your student information system beginning with 2019, 2020. The list of disciplines isn't very different from last year. It pretty much already met our needs for all the different reporting requirements that we have and for you have. We did remove community service because we didn't really feel like there was a need for that in any of the collections. That can just be reported in other. We modified the list of weapons that are available out there. We removed some club, other object, etc. Those can just be reported in the other area. You'll notice we have this pocket knife with a blade less than 2.5 inches. Why do we do that? Again, specifically for special education, because when they talk about dangerous weapons, they specifically state that a pocket knife with a blade less than 2.5 inches is not a weapon. So we spell that out in here so that if you report a student with that particular weapon and that student is a special education student, we will not include them as using a dangerous weapon. I want to go just kind of quickly over what data is collected in Advisor and where it's collected. You don't need to know this quite as much, but it kind of will help inform a couple of examples we want to go through in just a minute. Basically, there's 3 basic areas we get data. We get data about the incident itself. The main things to know here are the incident date. Let me see here. So the incident date here is important. That becomes important because if a student moves into or out of special education during the year, we have to know that date to know whether or not they were a special education student at the time of the incident. We also have to know then where it exists, what school it was at for some of our reporting purposes. And for CRDC, there's a couple of indicators for homicides and shootings. And again, we can't rely on the weapons to know whether or not it was a shooting, because most of the time when a weapon is brought to school, it's not actually discharged. Additional information on this, when we get into the student, we have to know obviously what student it is. If they were the perpetrator, we have to know that. If they're the victim and you want us to do your reporting, that initial file reporting for CRDC purposes, we need to know who the victim was, not so that we know who the victim is, but so we can get some of their demographics to report up in the CRDC. And again, specifically, it's only for harassment and bullying. The one thing we always say is, we're not doing this so that we can have all this data on your students and identify specific students. That's not why we do it. We do it in order to simplify and more accurately report the data where it needs to be reported. State reporting, EDFACS reporting, CRDC reporting. If you put the data in and we need it, we'll pull it out and we'll use it for our reporting. If the data goes in, but it turns out not to be a record we need for any reporting purposes, we're not going to pull it out and add it onto those reports. Again, and one other thing about the CRDC, if it is CRD specific and only used for CRDC, the SIS vendors are required to implement the changes necessary to report it. US districts are not required to report data that is only used for CRDC. This is one area it's easy to know it's only required for CRDC and you wouldn't have to be required to report it. And so I recognize that probably we will have a lot less victim data than we will perpetrator data when it comes to harassment or bullying, because that will be a decision some districts will make. But if you don't know, or if it could be used for either CRDC and it would also need to be used for other reporting purposes, we would need the data regardless of whether or not you're wanting us to submit your CRDC data for you. If you're not sure, let us know. Ask us, send in a ticket, and we will get back to you on that. And the email address for those tickets is at the end of the presentation. These are some other areas that we're collecting: weapons, what weapon it was, if it's applicable, serious bodily injury indicator. That, again, remember that was a special education one. If they refer to law enforcement or if there was a school-related arrest, those are both CRDC-related elements. I don't think any of this was bad, right? Okay. And then finally, on the discipline itself, we also need to know what the discipline date was. We need to know what discipline you did. Is it a suspension? Was it an expulsion? Was it an expulsion with services? We also do need, for every one of these, the discipline action length. We use those in a couple of different places. One of the main places we do use them is for special education reporting to EDFACS.
And if you are a special education reporter, you'll remember from the prior report, this is a very distinct separation between the greater than or equal to 10 days. So that 10-day is a big division in SPED reporting. And for what we submit to the feds, it makes a big difference. So that is a really important field to be populating. Yeah, or providing the data for.
So if you're wondering why your staff is wanting to know how long the discipline action was, that's why. And I believe there's might also be some CRDC reporting that is relevant there. But again, that the reporting even outside of CRDC, that information is important for us to have.
And that's also important per discipline. So, and I can't remember if our example gets to this or not, but if there is a student is suspended and they serve 6 days and then they are moved to a different setting, we're still recording those 6 days for that student. So that can sometimes get tricky, and I get lots of districts that call me on that one, and still feel free to call me when you have questions like that. But that is one area where it gets a little hairy.
And I want to say also, we recognize this is difficult. We recognize this isn't easy data for you guys to do. We're not saying it is. What we're trying to do is make the reporting of it easier by, those reports that are needed, by just having the data submitted as it's happening. You don't have to stop and think about what happened 6 months ago with that particular incident if you get it in the student information system with all the necessary data as it happens. A little bit more information. We also, the responsibility school, that's basically the school where the student is. If the student is assigned to an alternative school, what their assignment school is, unilateral removal, if that happens, that's important for special education. And for the firearm data that we submit to the feds, GFSA is Gun Free Schools Act, if their expulsion is modified to less than 1 year. Again, all that is information that we need for various reporting purposes. We're not collecting any data just for kicks and jollies. All of it is needed here for one thing or another. Okay, quick couple examples. Again, we recognize you guys aren't the reporters or usually the people entering this data in the system. Just give you an idea of why it is your staff needs this information. This example, we got Cindy, who got mad at her teacher for a bad grade and swore at her. She was given 1 day of in-school suspension for the incident to be served the next day. She attends ABC Middle School and is not a special education student. So basically, again, there were 3 basic areas data is recorded. The incident itself, the important things are the date of 9/19 and the school, ABC Middle School. Remember, an incident can have more than 1 student tied to it, which is why it's kind of broken out for reporting purposes. Sometimes when we're summing up the number of incidences, that may be different than summing up the number of students. And that is something we've always had reported that way in the past. The Student Discipline Incident Association. So one other area, again, she's a participant. She's the perpetrator. And that is a specific value that comes to us. Most of the time, more than likely, your student information systems are putting that in there for you. And then the behavior in this case, if we had looked at that list of behaviors, none of them really fit other than other. She didn't strike at the teacher. She pretty much just swore at her. And then when we get into the discipline itself, again, the discipline date, the discipline itself, in-school suspension, the action length 1 day, 1.0, and then ABC Middle School. And again, some of this information, the vendor may be putting them automatically for you if you're the one actually putting this in. So that was a really, really easy example. Robin's going to go over a much more complicated example that involves a special education student, again, to kind of show you some of the level of detail we're looking at here.
So on this second example, it is Terry brought a handgun to school to show off to his friends. While handling the gun in the boys' restroom, the gun went off, injuring his friend Jay. In accordance with the Gun Free Schools Act, Terry was expelled for the rest of the school year, which is prescribed in the Gun Free Schools Act, after a hearing on October 4th determined that the incident was not a manifestation of his disability, which is important for special education. He attends DEF High School and has an IEP. As part of his discipline, he was transferred to XYZ Alternative School to continue receiving educational and special education services. He was also referred to law enforcement for his violation of the Gun Free Schools Act, but was not arrested for the incident. His expulsion was later revised to allow him to return to DEF High School on March 16th, 2020.
A lot of details there.
So the identifier would be assigned by the vendor, the incident date would be recorded, and then the school, the 3 initial indicators of the discipline. He will be recorded as the perpetrator. The behavior is the weapon's possession. The weapon is a handgun. It is a gun-free schools violation. It is serious bodily injury, which again is SPED specific. And he was referred to law enforcement. The date would be recorded again. It is an expulsion with services, which is very, very important. We had some cases last year where those boxes are close to each other. And so we've had some issues where maybe they've been switched. So be very careful when you're inputting that data, because there's one without services. We're selecting for expulsion with services and expulsion without services, because if we have 15 students who are expelled with services, that's okay. But if we have 15 students that are expelled without services, we're going to have the feds coming to visit us and you. The discipline action length was initially 140 days. That was revised to 98 days, which will be updated. The responsibility school is the school he was at when he committed the offense or the act. He was moved to XYZ alternative school, and the Gun Free Schools Act expulsion was modified to less than 1 year, and that will be answered as true.
So again, you can see there's a lot of data that is going in. So your staff who's working in the student information system, it's important for them to have access and to know this when these things happen so they can properly get this information into the student information system in order to get it submitted to us. Again, advisor data submits pretty much transactionally. You enter the data, it gets submitted, sent into our system. You can go into the validation website, check to make sure it went in correctly. An example up here, because it does update, is that you could initially, when it happened, put in that you think it's going to be 140 days of action, because that's how many days are left in the school year. When it was modified, you can go in and check the modified button and change the number of days to 98. And again, it should update those records into the advisor system at that point. Okay. So that was pretty much the data, the information we wanted to provide to you. Recognizing that you're not the ones, most of you are not the ones entering this. If you are the ones entering it, I hope this provided you more information that you would need in order to do this. Again, though, there's so much data in Advisor and so much data related to discipline that's needed for all these different reporting requirements that trying to get it into one form to be submitted, it wasn't easy, especially trying to think of it through all the districts, but we really are trying to make it as streamlined as possible. If you ever, and this is one thing I know I asked when I was at the conference to the people in the audience, how many of them had filled out the special education discipline, and a number of people raised their hands, and I asked how many people enjoyed it, and everybody put their hands down. No one liked that report because it was you reported the same information over and over in different ways. And the intention here is that we can take that and we can do those different slicing and dicing that's needed for the federal reporting purposes by having this data in the system. It also will give you, if it's in your system and your student information system has ways for you to create your own custom reports, that data will be in there and you can create those reports and pull that data for your own purposes. So we're going to go ahead and take some questions now. So there is one right here. Which one are you? How do I get a copy of the PowerPoint? I believe that's going to be on the NDE Day website at the end of the presentation. We have not provided it to them yet. We will do that after the presentation today so that they can put it up there. How do you show a student enrolled in an alternative program once expelled? So the alternative program, it depends on whether or not that alternative program is one in your school or one that's out of your school. If it's one within your school, they're still going to be enrolled. It's just that you're going to probably move their enrollment to the alternative school. If it's one outside of the school and you're, say, contracting with them, this probably like a lot of other contracted service providers where you still have the responsibility for the student and you're still reporting their information.
And depending what kind of school that is, you'd refer to the who reports what document to show who will be responsible for reporting that student. And as always, if you have questions, you can contact us. I keep that document sitting on my desk because I have to refer to it myself quite often.
Okay, I got someone who says on Advisor validation, they're unable to click and access the 2 year-end reports. Okay, why don't you send in a ticket with the specific names of the reports? And real quick here. There's the email address if you're not familiar with it, advisorhelp@nebraskacloud.org. That way we can make sure we know if that there's a problem. I know that there were some servers being moved over at the ESUCC, which is where all of these advisor servers sit, and it did cause a few issues that we're still trying to make sure we get all of them resolved. We'll look to see if those reports were affected by that. How are mandatory reassignments or alternative placements entered for clarity?
So I started to answer this in the chat box, and on those students, if any of their time is served for their suspension before that determination has been made, it will be counted under suspension for those students, and then it will be marked accordingly. If the student is moved to an alternate placement, you will mark that under the removal. And that should, if there are any other like specific questions related to that, you can always run it by us, because some of them are a little more confusing than others, or tricky.
Yeah, and we get those questions in. Robin gets phone calls on them, etc. Okay. If you have more questions after today that you want to know about, feel free to send an email into the Advisor Help. Just tell them in the email that you had a question from this presentation, and they will direct it to either Robin or I to respond to. We also, if you want to contact us directly, we do have our email addresses up here. You can send one of us a direct email, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. The estimated time when the student level reports will be available in August. We're hoping in the next 2 weeks. And that would be what we're calling the discipline detail report.
And in the prior slide, we had shown the advisor resources. There's a really good resource out there that kind of outlines all the behaviors, all the discipline, all that sort of thing. And it's always a good one to have handy, keep with you when you are entering discipline data.
And we're also working on updating right now the 2019-20 data elements guidance. That will also have all of the new discipline behaviors, etc. in them. We don't have that completed yet. Okay. Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. We really do appreciate your time today, and I hope you've enjoyed the rest of NDE Day. And I would say drive safely, but you don't have to drive home from Kearney now. So
thank you.
Thank you.